Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. Each day, there's both chaos to make sense of, and God's mercies are new every morning. Good thing, huh? There are a few principles that we repeat every day as a framework for understanding what's going on around us in the world. Without this framework, we're an amorphous mass of jelly with no skeleton to hold us in place. First, God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's glory. And He's very jealous of His glory, by the way. He does not voluntarily share His primary glory with anyone. Second, the jewel of creation is man. It's a pretty exalted position, but it's not creator. It's just the jewel of creation. He's the only creature made in God's image in the sense that the Bible wants us to understand God's image. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God, as the sovereign creator, ordained Adam's fall. He wasn't surprised by it. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell, including not only the physical cosmos, but all of mankind. Or maybe you can do it the other way around. Not only all of mankind, but also the physical cosmos. Fifth, as a result of the fall, God pronounced a curse of enmity between the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, who had not been born, I understand, but was prospectively seen in the proto-evangelion in Genesis 3:15. And all those, of course, in Jesus, those are the seed of the woman. And the other half of the conflict is the seed of the serpent, the remainder of humanity together with Satan and his demons. This is known as the great antithesis. Sixth, all subsequent human social experience is an outworking of this antithesis. Seventh, the unregenerate, that is fallen mankind, are without excuse. They know God, but they suppress the truth about God in culpable self-deceit. As Paul says, they exchange the truth of God for a lie. We were talking about grace as it, in contrast with God's justice yesterday. We'll continue that today. Because grace, to be grace, cannot be earned, then it cannot be conditioned on anything in the recipient. Right? There's nothing in any human being that God looks at and says, well, I see something good there. I think I'll extend grace. No, first the good that he sees has to have been put there by him, by his grace. So his grace is his acting unilaterally for reasons entirely his own, which he does not choose to disclose to us, in this way or that way regarding his creatures. Paul goes into great detail with this concept in Ephesians chapter 1 and Romans chapter 9. When God exercises grace, he does favors for some, not for all. We say, what favors? Well, hey, guys, what does Paul, how does he define grace? God's unmerited favor. Unmerited favor. Well, if he has favor for some, he does favors for those he has favor for. This is not rocket science, or as my son-in-law would say, this is not rocket surgery. Because they are favors, they cannot be owed. We see it all around us, and we accept it as perfectly all right, except when we get to this issue. Let me give you an example. My brother Don has always enjoyed the gift of storytelling. In fact, he's written and published several highly entertaining novels. I've read them. I like them. I do not have this gift. God, by his grace, gave Don that gift. He did not give Sherman that gift. Does that mean he's unfair? Did his giving the gift to Don obligate him to give me the same gift? Really, can I complain that God is unfair because he gave my brother Don this marvelous gift of storytelling and didn't even give it to me? Listen, I have trouble telling jokes because I can't keep the parts of the story straight in my own mind. I usually tell the punchline and then I come back and try to fill in the joke, which is a joke on me. Now, I'm pretty good at a bon mot, coming up with something spontaneous, but I'm not good at telling jokes. Well, God was unfair, right? No. Did his giving that gift to me obligate him to give me a gift of equal value? Well, that would sound fair. Well, I have some other gift that's equal to that gift. Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. But it didn't obligate him to give me a gift of equal value. Listen, who gave Einstein his intellect? God. Who gave Sir Isaac Newton his intellect? God. Who else in the entire world, the history of the entire world, has he given such intellects to? No one. No one. No one. Not me for sure. And almost certainly not you. Well, is he unfair? Why did he give them those great gifts and not us? He doesn't tell us. And he doesn't owe us an explanation. And he certainly doesn't owe us to give us equal gifts. We all know people that we don't see that they have many gifts at all, or much of any gift. We don't want to say that. It seems so harsh. But we can clearly see there's a hierarchy in terms of who God gives gifts to and the goodness of the gifts he gives. He does not give gifts of equal value to everybody. We see that. God is perfectly free to give as he chooses. His giving to Don and not to me this gift of storytelling demonstrate both his grace and kindness and his absolute unquestionable freedom. His freedom. Now, if we want to talk about free will, let's talk about God's free will. Because if it comes down to whose free will determines who's chosen and who's not chosen, why should we bow to man's free will, sacrificing God's free will in the choice? Why should we not say, I will defer to God's free will, and I ain't going to worry about man's? He doesn't count in this. God is perfectly free to choose whom he wills to save or to give any other of his gifts. And giving a gift to one does not obligate him to give the similar gift or an equal gift or any gift at all to anyone else. That's the point. That principle is uniform if we're talking about the gift of storytelling, if we're talking about the gift of grace in his gifts of regeneration, faith, and repentance. It doesn't matter. The principle is exactly the same. And I know if that continues to rub across the grain of who you are, you're just allowing your traditions to control you. You're not allowing the truth to control you. I'm sorry. I know that sounds harsh, and it sounds as if I'm adopting a superior attitude. Guys, I was on the other side. I would still be there if I could be there, because believe me, the idea of men having free will to choose God appeals to me personally much more than the idea that God reaches down and chooses whom he will. That seems tough to me too, okay? And my knee-jerk reaction is, that's kind of unfair. But if you carefully analyze these things, you realize fairness has nothing to do with this. This is grace. This is God's grace. You can like God's grace or not like God's grace, but don't keep butting fairness into that. It has nothing to do with that. Those are entirely separate categories. If we can't think in clear and distinct categories, then the truth is we do not think. When we fail to distinguish categories, that are in fact distinct, we are failing to think. We're feeling, we're not thinking. Sorry, guys, that's what it is. And everybody can think. I'm not saying that you have to be smart or not smart. No. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with your commitment to the truth and your willingness to be courageous enough to seek the truth regardless of which of your toes gets stepped on, which of your favorite traditions gets stepped on. It comes down to that. Courage, not smarts. It is sometimes said, in opposition to God's gracious grant of faith to whom he will, without regard to merit, while passing others by, that if he did so, he would be showing respect for some persons against others in violation of the two passages that said God is no respecter of persons. One is Acts 10, verse 34. The other is Romans 2, verse 11. But let's take a look at those passages. Let's see. The first passage involves Peter's dream when the sheet is lowered and God commands him to eat all these unclean animals, and Peter says, no, in his dream. And then God says, lowers the sheet again and says, eat. And so finally, Peter agrees to do so. Then he wakes from the dream and finds that Cornelius, the centurion, is downstairs and wanting to talk to him. And you have to understand that for a Jew to invite a Gentile, and the centurion was a Gentile, into his home was anathema. I mean, you didn't do that. You did not do that. But he realizes that the dream he had was a prelude to set him up for that God was erasing the distinctions that were to be maintained between the Jews and the Gentiles, and that Peter was obligated then to bring Cornelius into his home and to bring the gospel, in fact, to Cornelius' home, which is what he ended up doing. And unless you understand how profoundly committed the Jews were to this idea that they were the chosen people and that the rest of the world had no part, although that's not what the Bible taught. Okay, the Bible taught that they were supposed to be a priesthood, a nation of priests who were supposed to be the example to the world, drawing the world to God and his law. That's not the role they envisioned for themselves, however. They wanted to see themselves as the special cuddled minority, that God loved them and he hated all these others. And so because of their specialness, and of course the laws of separation between the Jews and the Gentiles, they would have nothing to do with Gentiles, and they thought themselves superior. Okay? You have to understand that. So when Peter says that he perceives that Jesus is no respecter of persons, that God is no respecter of persons, what he's saying is that God is not just choosing Jews, he's extending his message to Gentiles as well. That's the context, that's what he's talking about, okay? Because to take it to mean that he offers all gifts equally to everybody just simply doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, if we saw it as God offering his gifts to some based upon their beliefs, then he would be looking for something inside them. He would be respecting their persons. Okay, now the second passage, Romans 2:11, is where Paul talks about God giving glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. That's Romans 2:10 and 11. Now, if we're going to take that passage to mean that God is giving glory and honor and peace based upon good deeds that are done by the recipient of his grace, then we have works righteousness. That's anathema to every Protestant. And Roman Catholics find that very appealing, but that's just not what Paul is talking about. He's talking about the same issue. He's talking about extending salvation from the Jews to the Greeks, that God has opened the doors, that no longer are the Jews alone his chosen people, that he will now be choosing his elect from every tribe and nation throughout the world. Doesn't mean he's going to be choosing everybody in every tribe and nation, but he's now extending the scope of his saving work to every tribe and nation. He will be choosing out of every tribe and nation, not only out of the Jews. If we see this as God granting faith in response to some good thing that the person did, not only does that become works righteousness, but it's evidence that we've got the cart before the horse. Faith is the horse pulling the cart of righteous works. Okay? If you have faith, as James says in chapter 2, I will show you my faith by my works. What does he mean by that? He's talking about the quality of one's faith. If you speak faith words, if you say, oh, I believe in Jesus, but you never do the things he requires, then you have a spoken faith, but it's not a live faith. It does not produce any works. I mean, if you have an apple tree that produces no apples, it's a dead apple tree for all intents and purposes. Our faith must be a productive faith. It must produce fruits. Now, if we do not produce any fruit, then our faith is dead. That's what they're talking about. The initiating power for salvation is God. Okay, the horse is God granting faith, regeneration, repentance. The cart is the works. It's the changes that occur in the redeemed because of God's work in them. Fearing God and working righteousness do not entitle anyone to salvation. They fear God and do righteous works after they have been regenerated. The point is, what brings a believer to life? Is it words he speaks that bring him to life? Does he bring himself to life? Or is it a unilateral, sovereign act of God by his grace that brings him to life, like the dead, dry bones in Ezekiel, after which they become alive and then start doing things live people do, believing and acting faithfully. In fact, the argument could very plausibly be made that if God responded by quickening those who had first feared him and lived righteously, he would then be showing respect of persons because his choice would be based on something specific to the person chosen. You understand? If he looks down there and he says, oh, there's a man after my own heart. I had nothing to do with that, but because of that, I'm going to choose to give him salvation. He would then be showing respect to that person and not to that person. Does that make sense? If he chooses some among the mass of the lost without reference to anything good or bad they have done, to magnify his grace, mercy, and power, then he does not show respect of persons, because his decision has nothing to do with the one chosen, except inasmuch as the one chosen is, for God's undisclosed purpose, an appropriate object of his saving work. This makes the role of the saved one entirely secondary and responsive to the role and work of God in salvation, as it should be. At this point, confusion often abounds. There is an idea abroad that all human beings are basically good. I know you've heard that. It's it's uh, uh, it's the heart of modernism, okay? The heart of rationalism. It's the heart of Marxism. It's the heart of Romanticism. Uh, all of these isms, they have a faulty view of God and a faulty view of man. They see God as a sort of a Superman, if they have any use for him at all. And they see man as a sort of a less Superman than God, but a lot superer than he really is. They see him as basically good and perfectible. If you wonder why the progressive politicians are constantly trying to legislate us into being better people, why do they want control over us all the time? Because they think that they can legislate us, they can pass laws and force us to become better people. Listen, as unjust and horrid as the Jim Crow laws were in the United States in the prior to the 60s when those began being changed, the truth is that a person's freedom to associate or not associate with whomever he wishes ought to be free from any restraint or imposition by the government. The government has no business getting into that area. Now, all of the Jim Crow laws that divided the people out, those needed to be repealed. Why? Because the government has no business saying you can't associate with black people or orange people or people who have size 7 feet instead of size 10 or anything like that. But they also can't be telling you, you must associate with these people. Whether we associate or don't associate with whomever ought to be a matter of perfect freedom as far as the government is concerned. As far as God is concerned, it's not a matter of perfect freedom. We are to be fair to everyone. We're not to be unduly, unfairly prejudiced against anyone based upon anything. We need to be fair all the time, or we will not receive God's approval for what we're doing. But listen, the government exists in order to protect us from criminal behavior, not protect us from the evil that we might do against one another that falls short of criminal behavior. If I covet somebody else's wife, I commit a sin. However, that has nothing to do with what the government is set up for. It has no business governing my thoughts, punishing my thoughts, asking me, have you coveted this man's wife? Oh, yes, well, then I'm going to punish you. It's none of the government's business. Now, it may be the government's business if I commit adultery with her, and I would argue, should be the government's business. A lot of people would say it shouldn't be, but God says it should be. He makes adultery a crime, not just a sin. He does not make coveting a crime. He makes it only a sin. So what's not a crime is not a proper purview for government action. What is only a sin is between ourselves and God, and perhaps ourselves and our families or ourselves and our churches. Those are all separate issues, but that has nothing to do with God. I realize that I've probably just confused everything and gotten people to think that I'm a racist. Well, I'm not. In fact, I have no use for making divisions between people in any way except between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. All other divisions that we draw, I submit, are illegitimate, or they only are illustrative for very, very specific purposes and very limited purposes. I think it's fine to say the only people who should be able to practice medicine are doctors, for instance. And I would think it's a good idea for everybody else not to practice medicine because you could end up killing people. So there's a division that I think is legitimate, but I don't think it's any of the business of the government about who practices medicine or who doesn't. It's the business of the people, or perhaps the medical profession. I mean, they arguably have a right to decide who they will admit into their group, and we, as the public, ought to have a right to decide, I want this guy to help me, even if he doesn't have an MD, or I don't want this guy to help me, even if he does have an MD, because I don't trust him. That should be entirely up to us. We got a lot of confusion on that issue. What should the government be doing? What should it not be doing? The government is not God. The government is under God's authority and has a specific role under God. And we need to be sure that we keep them in that specific role. They are not allowed to do whatever they feel like doing, and we just cannot allow them to think that they can do that. Anyway, getting back to the question of the idea that everybody is basically good, that is the idea. That and people tend to think that the reason they're lost is because they don't have enough knowledge. Surely they will not be condemned because of what they did not know. Huh? If they had known enough about Jesus, they would have done the right thing and believed. No. Hopefully by this time, the error in that thinking should be apparent and obvious. Romans 3:10 and following make it plain that no one is good and all have fallen. What does it say in Romans 3:10? None is righteous, no, not one. All right, now let me ask you. Who is included in the class of non-righteous? Everybody. Who is excluded? Who belongs to another class, the class of the righteous? Coming out of fallen humanity, unless regenerated by God? No one. Everyone not regenerated by God is unrighteous. Everyone. No one seeks after God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Now, if you don't like to believe that, fine. Here's your choice. Start your own religion. Stop claiming you're a Christian. This is what the Bible says. Either believe the Bible or throw it out. Don't you have a trash can? Throw it in the trash can. You don't need it. You won't follow it. If you decide you're going to follow this passage and not that passage, then who's the authority? Is it the Bible that's the authority over you, or you're the authority over the Bible? Well, if you're the authority, why do you need it at all? Just do your own thing, whatever it is. Hey, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. You do too. Moreover, Romans 1:18 through 23 strips away the excuse that unbelievers are doing their best according to the knowledge of God they possess. What does it say? Let me quote it. It's a little bit long, but pay attention. It's important. Quote, "For the wrath of God," the wrath. Oh, this is Paul talking about the wrath of God. This is the New Testament. I thought the Old Testament God was the wrathful God, and the New Testament God is the God of love. By the way, that's a form of Gnosticism. Okay, it's not Christianity at all. "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them." All the fallen human beings. That's what he's talking about. "For his invisible attributes, God's, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made." What is Paul saying? He says, hey, look around you. You see God's eternal power and his divine nature. It is screaming at you in everything that you see in his creation. Wherever you look, open your eyes, whatever you see, it's screaming out God's eternal power and divine nature. So they're without excuse. If you want to make an excuse for the unbelievers, excuse me, I'll make an excuse for myself and my cough. Be assured that Paul is not with you on that. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." I thought they were already dark. They were. And yet God darkened them further because he gave them over to what they wanted to do. "Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. End quotation. Clearly, they know God and suppress that knowledge in unrighteousness, rendering futile their defense of ignorance. Man is not lost by a failure of knowledge. He is lost by a failure of submissive faith. He's responsible to submit, to believe, and to repent. And he loves his own desires more than he loves submitting to God, so he will never do that unless God changes his nature, thus changing his desires. That's the way it goes. Why does God not save everyone? Well, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay? It's a good question, though, don't you think? Why doesn't God save everyone? Surely Jesus' death was sufficient for that, huh? Think about that. We'll talk about it tomorrow. I pray God's blessing on you today, that you have a good day and stay safe. And we'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you.